Better keep your balance. Most welcome to 942. It is progressing quite swiftly here, and I think a special boost was given by dear old Susie Frobel. Old lady, you can say, but she is very revealing, always taking in the very latest of information and research, and being at least, I would say, 8 or 9 years ahead of her time. Marvelously presented as well. She's a good writer, even if English is not her original language. To be a science book, it's amazingly fluent as well, and even funny at times, although those occasions are quite rare. Let's see here. It has to do with skill. I think today's lecture 942 I want to name how to develop skill, and I'd say generally taken that once upon a time we all developed skill in our life world. My particular interest has always lied with the people of the Renaissance and how they constantly acquired better and better ways of doing things with their hands and their bodies. And I think this is especially pertinent because when you learn to do something with your hand, you get a specific interactivity with the world, something that cannot be gained otherwise. It cannot be done from the inside. This is something I mentioned earlier. The modern educational system, for some reason, seems to think that knowledge can be gained from some sort of weird transference where the teacher's skills somehow magically would appear in the pupil or the student. We know today that knowledge, memory, projection, retention, all that can only be stored in the movement. Only the movement is fractally complicated enough to have a storage capacity for all this information and knowledge. And it's also only the movement that can carry what has happened before into the future. That's the only place anything can get informed. The old copycat model of taking the computer as a model for the human brain now seems utterly ridiculous. It is as ridiculous coming from one of the biggest neurologists, David Bradel. It's as ridiculous as seeing the human brain or the human body to be a clock or a steam machine. We in the West too easily get stuck in these metaphors, or what you call them, or gestalt. And it's time that neurology sort of shake those restricted and biased ideas coming from a semi-mythological idea of we can easily and directly in this now find something that is exactly as a human being. Might there be a clock, steam machine, or today a computer? And also there have been some criticism from the computer guys saying, isn't it absolutely ridiculous to think that the human being could be anything like a computer? Computers are man-made for a specific purpose. I heard one comment, I don't know who it was, but he said this is the very height of ignorance, just taking a random object in one's environment and looking at what is vaguely similar, constructing the idea of memory and executive function, almost like the RAM working memory in the computer, and say that is an absolutely passive process to archive memory and also to take it out, and you don't have to do anything. It goes against all ideas of how human beings developed once upon a time. It is a simplification that doesn't even deserve a laugh. everything that has passed is accessible to us more or less in varying degrees. Sometimes it's more shadowy, more faint, sometimes it's stronger. But everything that has ever happened in the universe is fractally transferred, so to speak, but it's not really about transference. Reading off is an interaction that changes both things. It's important to understand what's outside and what's inside do not remain unchanged. The old idea was that the outside world somehow remained as it was before it was read or interacted with. All these read or perception ideas is absolutely ridiculous. It's not a readout of some sort. Both object and subject side dramatically and forever changes after observation. We are absolutely dependent to read off the wave or the movement that is coming from the past to be able to project. And this is where skill comes in. The cerebellum I mentioned before is all about skill, and it's incredibly different from human being to human being. Since we abandon this idea of an outside world that doesn't change, we start to realize that there is huge difference in how much world a person gets from person to person. Depending on their status would be one thing, and I'm not talking about economic or class status, I'm talking about the status in the complexity of the system. We all have our own ready-made position that we took, and we stay on to that position, and that sort of defines who we are, for better or worse. These days I would say it's for worse, because that position is no longer acknowledged. It is shoved into the background, so we are no longer aware of our position in reality. That makes every encounter to be at least potentially a conflict, and where there is a winner and there is a loser. We have become very cruel in our interacting with other people because of that. We lost the knowledge where everyone are situated, and instead, for each and every time we interact, we have a massive fight. This is very similar to a hen yard, where the different cocks every day needs to re-establish their hierarchical order if the cocks are changed. But if they're the same cocks, once the order is established, peace and harmony and even some sort of respect will linger. But this no longer goes with human beings. We forcefully and violently put people into their place, and we use our whole body to show in an automatic, unaware manner that you are less, I am more, I understand more, you understand less. And this is the modern, very unequal way of doing things. Much more unequal than has previously been the case. A lot of the promises of the French Revolution had to be fulfilled by making something that cannot be called anything but a violent, cruel mood to reality. That we just decide everything is just, and we don't care what is the reality. And by not caring to the reality, we make reality unknown. We can no longer access reality, we cannot interact with it, so instead we react instinctively, automatically, enforcing our authority of others, and the society as such demands that everyone accept the same sterile model for reality. It will be different in each and other one, but everyone will see and feel the same downward pull from authority. An authority that is demanding, it does not allow for any freedom. It is a bit like the Systembolaget of thinking. Systembolaget is the Swedish liquor monopoly that has a very decisive role to play in each and every Swede. It tells you that you can't even control your liquor behavior, and therefore you are relieved of your responsibility for your own thinking. Although I don't think everyone falls for this, I would say at least 60–70% do that. They stop to feel responsible for their own lives, because it is a very fragile responsibility. We have a lot of locomotion and sharp looks from other people and sharp attacks. Not so much cooperation that used to be the case in Sweden, for instance. Everything becomes more brutal. Brutalization in perception is this very sharp division between black and white and so forth. Whereas a higher complexity means that you are able to discern lower scale differences. And those differences do not always, sometimes they do, but do not always have to take the shape of polarities. We need to realize that the subject and the object both are parts of the world. Neglecting one of these parts will also block out the other one. So you cannot, in this case, not keep one and sort of think by blocking out the other one, I will also gain access to the one I'm sort of want to cling on to. Well, reality doesn't subside to threats. Reality is what it is. Despite what classical physics thinks, reality won't yield in that way. It is constructed in a certain way. And we be lucky to understand that way, and we be very unlucky if we don't understand that way. And it's a matter of degree. Coming to understand the world means also that we gain success. Not understanding the world means that we don't gain success. We become unsuccessful in our decisions, in our thinking, in our way of being, and our perception of the world, our making of the world disappears, and we lose this wonderful thing called human worth. I would say that's a scarcity today. Didn't used to be the case when everyone had their slot. So the subject needn't in those times to be the absolute limits of what you could be. You could be a farmer to your utmost happiness. And you can take in things and you can be free to think whatever you want. Today we're not free to think whatever we want. And therefore, of course, the state doesn't have to decide everything, because you already given up so much free choice. Nobody is doing any farmer revolts anymore. There are no ducky feuds, there are nothing of violence. I would say that also means that people given up somewhere. They do not interact with the world. They have become passive bystanders to their own society, their own family, their own dealings. By establishing a very sharp difference between inside and outside, we also establish this idea that the subject doesn't have to be involved in the excavations, the exploration of the outside, the exogenous, or the radical difference. That grave misunderstanding is absolutely horrible, especially as Susie Frobel points out that the subject is at least as complex as the outside world. Neglecting to understand that will immediately lead to that you don't access that complexity. You end up with a very simple polarity, one-way fashions polarity, simplification, a stupefaction, I would say. And this stupefaction is usually in black and white pictures as usual, and those will always not be stable. This is something we mentioned so many times. I hope it really goes into your hearts. Once these crude polarities are established, they will, no matter what, change into their opposites within time. And I always held Bertrand Russell to be a scare example, frightful example, someone who changed positions more than 20 times. And this is because he was logocentric himself. He was looking for a center. Polarities never make up for good action. Polarities always lead to weakness, lack of direction, and lack of decision. And it also leads to lack of understanding, because those things goes hand in hand. Somebody will directly notice if you don't have understanding. Understanding has nothing to do whether you are epistemologically right, that you had looked into certain books, you had made certain research. It has to 80% to do with the complexity. And of course the complexity will be greater in those books that tells the truth. But it is not the true origin that decide what is true or not. It is what you directly perceive. And of course, when we don't perceive, when we don't train our perceiving skills on a daily basis, like people used to do, using their hands, becoming more and more efficient. I think a good example is the Neolithic flint axe. It takes 2 years to learn how to do it, but it takes generations to make the finest axe. And the still to this day cannot be replicated. That will take a further 3-4 generations, even though we have seen the ready-made material. And this is extremely important to understand. This is the loss of knowledge that we have in modern time. It is absolutely extreme. And it started circa by the time of Isaac Newton, possibly a little bit earlier. People of the Renaissance still understood centrism wasn't wholly good, that we needed paradoxes. And I think it was an excellent example of that Susie Frobel put in when she mentioned Holbein's The Ambassadors, that has this big paradox in the middle of the screen, Memento Morti. Remember that you are deadly. And it was also interesting how she showed that in the beginning you won't be able to read off that extra thing that looks to be in the floor in front of the ambassadors. You can't read that off as being a skull. You need to change your perspective, move your head, go and change the painting, and then you can see the skull. But once you're starting to acquire the skill to see it from the other angle, you can also see it in the end, directly looking at it. And by pointing out that, she points out something very important, and that is that perception is skill. and it's very different how much you train it. And it's not very hard to understand that the most devastating thing you can ever think about the world and yourself is that everything is passive. It's a little bit like saying to somebody who's sleeping on the bench in a football game that you are already participating in the game, and you do not need to wake up. You can sit there and train. And this is what the modern schooling system does. It says to you, you only need to passively acquire these things, like a computer. Put it in the input, store it somewhere in your computer memory, and let the executive function works to the best. And that function will take out your stored memories. And those stored memories are like photos taken or holographic photos taken of previous moments that are now past and now living in the churchyard of absent time. Well, you hear yourself, some of these angles are absolutely ridiculous beyond belief. But it's a good sign once you start laughing at these, because then you come to the level of understanding that these are actually things you don't criticize. You just shake them off because they are actually in some certain aspects too ridiculous even to criticize. So what you need to do is bring your awareness into these darkened areas of our thinking. And it sounds easy, but you need to know where to look. And I would say in the beginning you don't even need a certain skill. Skill would be something you develop later. But in the beginning it's more curiosity that's needed of you. Is it really true that what Hans is speaking of, that we have these darkened areas, and that it might not have to be the case that subject and object always has to be divided just in the middle, or whatever this random take is? Couldn't it be better to change the focal set and let it glide depending on the situation and the need? Nothing of knowledge really disappears. I mean, that might be the oddest thing to say, and I personally completely agree. I was in the idea until recently at least that these masterpieces of the Renaissance, architecture, music and so forth, are definitely gone for good. In one way that is true. It's not as easily accessible to build the skill within these areas. But in another matter, it cannot be completely lost because it has already put its imprint on the world. And to be permanently lost, also gone, it also means that I sort of argue maybe a bit too much in the direction that the pastime is absolutely absent. And that claim we have been looking into, and I think it's been shown now that it has its weak points. It doesn't seem to be the case. And if it were the case, where would time disappear to? Somehow it doesn't really make sense. And one good clue for me was, why would it be that simple, that time just disappear? It has to be more complicated time. And we mentioned already 2 lectures ago about the nesting of time. Very few people in the West are aware of this, but most Easterners are, for instance. That's a very important trait. Our time is a simplification, very easy way out. We just say it, and by saying it we don't think any further. And of course, once you start delving into knowledge, you no longer need these helping tools, if they are helping tools, like epistemology, for instance, where you need to really understand where something originated to be sure that that's the real McCoy, that that is really knowledge. That is a very complicated and difficult task, and it can go absolutely wrong, can go completely wrong like it did in the Third Reich. Very few people would have claimed today that the Third Reich was a good idea, no matter what political inclination you have today. But to know that it was a bad idea already then. And I asked many people to explain to me, how would you know if you were in Germany and you were trusting these epistemological lines that people had to use because they did lack fractal knowledge. They never were successors to the Roman Empire. Only a few states, like Bavaria and the riparian state. Yeah, it's called that in English. It's called Rheinpfalz in Swedish, and in German, of course. Apart from that, very few areas of Germany were actually affected by the massive knowledge that came to be a part of the Roman Empire for 700 years. And that makes a huge change. That makes you much more complex, much more able to discern things without having to rely on sort of external, complicated Sherlock Holmes ways of finding out what then has to be sealed as being true. It's a very complicated process, and it goes wrong most often. We have this stupid debate in Sweden about fake news, and how on God's earth, well, the one first is take, how important are the news? Nobody put them in any scale. Of course, the news that concerns Sweden should be much more important because of closeness. But within the news of Sweden, there is no hierarchy either. Who should do that? Nobody's clever enough to do those things. Journalists, heck no, there's no chance. So everything gets mixed, and it's this nonsensical idea that you can put all the different truths in one big bag and just hand them out. And once you start mixing fake news within the production of lemon juice, or fake news when it comes to why they are warring between Russia and Ukraine, somewhere the point gets lost. It's impossible to sift through the right order of things. It's not just about true, it's about how important are the thing, because you can't do anything, all things at the same time. So there are so many problems with the old epistemological model, and Derrida shows clearly it is a very, very lousy helping tool, epistemology. It's dependent on so many factors that are hidden from sight, hidden from perception, and cannot be controlled. And his point is that we can access knowledge more directly. We can access truth directly, and this is also the idea of Susie Froebel, that complexity itself reveals its truth. And I say hooray to that, because that is what I realized when I study old books about things used to be. They didn't use Sherlock Holmes like derivation orders or calculations, or try to find the original truth, and only that could be true enough. Those complexions would make you completely weak, and in the end, once you fail, you need to rely even more on these random takes on what is true. Truth needs to be founded where you stand, and if you don't access your own subjective stance, your fractality, and get into more balance, how on earth can you tell what's true and what's false? How could you tell what's true and false if your use is bad? Because bad use, as Alexander pointed out, affects all levels, and especially perception and your access to reality. Actually, in the neck position lies the human worth, what you are worthy, what you deserve. Therefore, we are constructed highly unequal. In a way we can't deal with, we can hide it and therefore make inequality much worse. I think this is enough just for now. Let's continue later on. I say thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye for now.